So every once in a while when you're doing binding, the binding isn't going to sit correctly. What you're going to need to do is fill that gap or rebind the guitar. And both of those are pretty much a waste of your time. There's a luthier trick that I've learned over the years that'll help fill that gap. So this is the binding for the Les Paul that I had just shown. And there was a little gap at the horn here. And what now I need to do is take a acetone and binding mix. Essentially what you do is you get a bunch of strips of binding, drop it in a glass container, add some acetone into that mix, and then what you want to do is you want to drip it into the spot that you need fixing. So you let this compound sit, a couple days, get it nice and slimy and gooey, and you'll get these little chunks and little drips. Here I've got a little bit too much acetone in this mix, but what you can do is if you do that, you let this sit uncovered, and some of the acetone will evaporate. What you do is you mix this up, make sure it's nice, and you just take a couple drips and drip it into the spot that you want to put a little bit of a binding fix. And now what will happen is this will dry overnight and it'll fill that gap pretty much perfectly. And what's nice about working with binding and acetone is that this will melt back into itself, because it's the properties of the binding, since it's got that acetone mix, it'll just remelt now. And what I'll do is I'll let this sit overnight, and maybe I'll come back and I'll do another fill if I need to. But I tape off the area that needs binding, and I'll just go ahead now that I've put a little bit in here, and boom. Got a little bit of a nick that I'll have to clean off with a little bit of a razor blade, but now that gap pretty much disappeared. So as you go around the binding, you'll see little gaps here and there, and sometimes guys just use a grain filler or a pore filler. I always like to dissolve binding in acetone and go back and fill it properly so it looks good when you're doing it, at a real professional level. So this really helps with a couple little gaps here and there. If you've got big major gaps, you're going to want to heat off the binding and redo it. But for little fixes here and there, this is kind of the binding's dirty little secret, when needed. So I'll let this sit overnight, and then I'll sand it off, and I should have a completely filled gap, and just got one little mark there that I'll have to sand away. But it looks pretty good. So this is the dirty little binding trick.